Stanford University.
Okay, let's get started. All right, so welcome to Lecture 5. Today we're going to be getting to the title of the class, Convolutional Neural Networks. Okay, so a couple administrative details before we get started. Assignment 1 is due Thursday, April 20th, 11:59 p.m. on Canvas. We're also going to be releasing Assignment 2 on Thursday. Okay, so a quick review of last time. We talked about neural networks and how we had the running example of the linear score function that we talked about through the first few lectures. And then we turned this into a neural network by stacking these linear layers on top of each other with nonlinearities in between. And we also saw that this could help address the mode problem, where we are able to learn intermediate templates that are looking for example, different types of cars, right? A red car versus a yellow car, and so on, and to combine these together to come up with a final score function for a class. Okay, so today we're going to talk about convolutional neural networks, which is basically the same sort of idea, but now we're going to learn about convolutional layers that reason on top of basically explicitly trying to maintain spatial structure. So let's first talk a little bit about the history of neural networks and then also how convolutional neural networks were developed. So we can go all the way back to 1957 with Frank Rosenblatt, who developed the Mark I perceptron machine, which was the first implementation of an algorithm called the perceptron, which had sort of the similar idea of getting score functions, right, using some w times x plus a bias. But here the outputs are going to be either 1 or a 0. And then in this case, we have an update rule, so an update rule for our weights w, which also look kind of similar to the type of update rule that we're also seeing in backprop. But in this case, there was no principled backpropagation technique yet. We just sort of took the weights and adjusted them in the direction towards the target that we wanted. So in 1960, we had Widrow and Hoff, who developed Adeline and Madeline, which was the first time that we were able to get to stack these linear layers into multi-layer perceptron networks. And so this is starting to now look kind of like this idea of neural network layers, but we still didn't have backprop or any sort of principled way to train this. And so the first time backprop was really introduced was in 1986 with Rumelhart. And so here we can start seeing these kinds of equations with the chain rule and the update rules that we're starting to get familiar with, right? And so this is the first time we started to have a principled way to train these kinds of network architectures. And so after that, it still wasn't able to scale to very large neural networks. And so there's sort of a period in which there wasn't a whole lot of new things happening here or a lot of popular use of these kinds of networks. And so this really started being reinvigorated around the 2000s. So in 2006, there was this paper by Jeff Hinton and Ruslan Salukudinov, which basically showed that we could train a deep neural network and show that we could do this effectively. But it was still not quite this sort of modern iteration of neural networks. It required really careful initialization in order to be able to do backprop. And so what they had here was they would have this first pre-training stage where you model each hidden layer through a restricted Boltzmann machine. And so you're going to get some initialized weights by training each of these layers iteratively. And so once you get all of these hidden layers, you then use that to initialize your full neural network, and then from there you do backprop and fine-tuning of that. And so when we really started to get the first really strong results using neural networks, and what sort of really sparked the whole craze of starting to use these kinds of networks really widely was at around 2000, 2012, where we had first the strongest results using for speech recognition. And so this is work out of Jeff Hinton's lab for acoustic modeling and speech recognition. And then for image recognition, 2012 was the landmark paper from Alex Kraszewski in Jeff Hinton's lab, which which introduced the first convolutional neural network architecture that was able to get really strong results on ImageNet classification. And so it took the ImageNet image classification benchmark and was able to dramatically reduce the error on that benchmark. And so since then, ComNets have gotten really widely used in all kinds of applications. So now let's step back and take a look at what gave rise to convolutional neural networks specifically. And so we can go back to the 1950s, where Hubel and Wiesel did a series of experiments trying to understand how neurons in the visual cortex worked. And they studied this specifically for cats. And so we talked a little bit about this in lecture 1. But basically in these experiments, they put electrodes in the cat, into the cat brain, and they gave the cat different visual stimulus, right? And so things like, different kinds of edges, oriented edges, different sorts of shapes, and they measured the response of the neurons to these stimuli. And so there were a couple of important conclusions that they were able to make and observations. And so the first thing they found that, there's sort of this topographical mapping in the cortex. So nearby cells in the cortex also represent nearby regions in the visual field. And so you can see, for example, on the right here, where if you take kind of the spatial mapping and map this onto a visual cortex, there's more peripheral regions are these blue areas, farther away from the center. And so they also discovered that these neurons had a hierarchical organization. And so if we look at different types of visual stimuli, they were able to find that at the earliest layers, retinal ganglion cells were responsive to things that looked kind of like circular regions of spots. And then on top of that, there are simple cells. And these simple cells are responsive to oriented edges, so different orientation of the light stimulus. And then going further, they discovered that these were then connected to more complex cells, which were responsive to both light orientation as well as movement, and so on. And you get, increasing complexity. For example, hypercomplex cells are now responsive to movement with kind of an endpoint, right? And so now you're starting to get the idea of corners and then blobs and so on. And so then in 1980, the neocognitron was the first example of a network architecture, a model that had this idea of simple and complex cells that Hubel and Wiesel had discovered. And in this case, Fukushima put these into these alternating layers of simple and complex cells, where you had these simple cells that had modifiable parameters, and then complex cells on top of these that performed this sort of pooling, so that it was invariant to different minor modifications from the simple cells. And so this is work that was in the 1980s, right? And so by 1998, Jan LeCun basically showed the first example of applying backpropagation and gradient-based learning to train convolutional neural networks that did really well on document recognition. And specifically, they were able to do a good job of recognizing digits of zip codes. And so these were then used pretty widely for zip code recognition in the Postal Service. But beyond that, it wasn't able to scale yet to more challenging and complex data. Right? Digits are still fairly simple and a limited set to recognize. And so this is where Alex Krzyzewski in 2012 gave the modern incarnation of convolutional neural networks. And his network we sort of colloquially call AlexNet. But this network really didn't look so much different than the convolutional neural networks that Jan LeCun was dealing with. They're now, they were scaled now to be larger and deeper and able to, the most important parts were that they were now able to take advantage of the large amount of data that's now available, in web images, in the ImageNet data set, as well as take advantage of the parallel computing power in GPUs. And so we'll talk more about that later. But fast forwarding today, so now ComNets are used everywhere. And so we have the initial, classification results on ImageNet from Alex Krzyzewski. This is able to do a really good job of image retrieval. You can see that, when we're trying to retrieve a flower, for example, the features that are learned are really powerful for doing similarity matching. We also have ComNets that are used for detection. So we're able to do a really good job of localizing, where in an image is, for example, a bus or a boat and so on, and draw precise bounding boxes around that. We're able to go even deeper beyond that to do segmentation, right? So these are now richer tasks where we're not looking for just the bounding box, but we're actually going to label every pixel and the outline of, trees and people and so on. And these kind of algorithms are used in, for example, self-driving cars. And a lot of this is powered by GPUs, as I mentioned earlier, that's able to do parallel processing and able to efficiently train and run these ComNets. And so, we have the modern, powerful GPUs, as well as ones that work in embedded systems, for example, that you would use in a self-driving car. So we can also look at some of the other applications that ComNets are used for. So face recognition, right? We can put an input image of a face and get out a likelihood of who this person is. ComNets are applied to video. And so this is an example of a video network that looks at both images as well as temporal information. And from there is able to classify videos. We're also able to do pose recognition, being able to recognize, shoulders, elbows, and different joints. And so here are some images of our fabulous TA Lane in various kinds of pretty non-standard human poses. But ComNets are able to do a pretty good job of pose recognition these days. They're also used in game playing. So some of the work in reinforcement learning, deep reinforcement learning that you may have seen, playing Atari games, and Go, and so on, and ComNets are an important part of all of these. Some other applications, so they're being used for interpretation and diagnosis of medical images, for classification of galaxies, for street sign recognition. There's also whale recognition. This is from a recent Kaggle challenge. We also have examples of looking at aerial maps and being able to draw out where are the streets on these maps, where are buildings, and being able to segment all of these. And then beyond recognition of classification, detection, these types of tasks, we also have tasks like image captioning, where given an image, we want to write a sentence description about what's in the image. And so this is something that we'll go into a little bit more later in the class. And we also have really, really fancy and cool kind of artwork that we can do using neural networks. And so on the left is an example of Deep Dream, where we're able to take images and kind of hallucinate different kinds of objects and concepts in the image. There's also neural style type work where we take an image and we're able to re-render this image using a style of a particular artist and artwork, right? And so here we can take, for example, Van Gogh on the right, Starry Night, and use that to redraw our original image using that style. And Justin has done a lot of work in this, and so if you guys are interested, these are images produced by some of his code, and you guys should talk to him more about it. Okay, so basically, this is just a small sample of where ComNets are being used today, but there's really a huge amount that can be done with this, right? And so, for your guys' projects, sort of, let your imagination go wild, and we're excited to see what sorts of applications you can come up with. So today we're going to talk about how convolutional neural networks work. And again, same as with neural networks, we're going to first talk about how they work from a functional perspective without any of the brain analogies, and then we'll talk briefly about some of these connections. Okay, so last lecture, we talked about this idea of a fully connected layer. And how, for a fully connected layer, what we're doing is we operate on top of these vectors, right? And so let's say we have, an image, 3D image, 32 by 32 by 3, so some of the images that we were looking at previously. We'll take that, we'll stretch all of the pixels out, right? And then we have this 3072 dimensional vector, for example, in this case. And then we have these weights, right? So we're going to multiply this by a weight matrix. And so here, for example, our W, we're going to say is 10 by 3072. And then we're going to get the activations, the output of this layer, right? And so in this case, we take each of our 10 rows, and we do this dot product with the 3072 dimensional input. And from there, we get this one number that's kind of the value of that neuron. And so in this case, we're going to have 10 of these neuron outputs. And so a convolutional layer, so the main difference between this and the fully connected layer that we've been talking about is that here we want to preserve spatial structure. And so taking this 32 by 32 by 3 image that we had earlier, instead of stretching this all out into one long vector, we're now going to keep the structure of this image, right, this three-dimensional input. And then what we're going to do is our weights are going to be these small filters. So in this case, for example, a 5 by 5 by 3 filter. And we're going to take this filter and we're going to slide it over the image spatially and compute dot products at every spatial location. And so we're going to go into detail of how exactly this works. So our filters, first of all, always extend the full depth of the input volume. And so they're going to be just a smaller spatial area, so in this case 5 by 5, right, instead of our full 32 by 32 spatial input, but they're always going to go through the full depth, right? So here we're going to take 5 by 5 by 3. And then we're going to take this filter, and at a given spatial location, we're going to do a dot product between this filter and then a chunk of the image. So we're just going to overlay this filter on top of a spatial location in the image, right? And then do the dot product, the multiplication of each element of that filter with each corresponding element in that spatial location that we've just plopped it on top of. And then this is going to give us a dot product. So in this case, we have 5 times 5 times 3. This is the number of multiplications that we're going to do, right? Plus a bias term. And so this is basically taking our filter W and basically doing W transpose times X and plus bias. So is that clear how this works? Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, when we do the dot product, do we turn the 5 by 5 by 3 into one vector? Yeah, and in essence, that's what you're doing. You can think of it as just popping it on and doing the element-wise multiplication at each location, but this is going to give you the same result as if you stretched out the filter at that point, stretched out the input volume that it's laid over, and then took the dot product. And that's what's written here. Yeah, question? Oh, this is, so the question is, any intuition for why this is a W transpose? And this was just, not really, this is just the notation that we have here to make the math work out as a dot product. So it just depends on how you're representing W and whether, in this case, if we look at the W matrix, this happens to be each column, and so we're just taking the transpose to get a row out of it. But there's no intuition here. We're just taking the filters of W and we're stretching it out into a 1D vector. And in order for it to be a dot product, it has to be like a 1 by n vector. Okay, so the question is W here not 5 by 5 by 3? It's 1 by 75. So that's the case, right? If we're going to do this dot product of W transpose times X, we have to stretch it out first before we do the dot product. So we take the 5 by 5 by 3, and we just take all these values and stretch it out into a long vector. And so again, similar to the other question, the actual operation that we're doing here is plopping our filter on top of a spatial location in the image and multiplying all the corresponding values together. But in order just to make it kind of an easy expression similar to what we've seen before, we can also just stretch each of these out, make sure that like dimensions are transposed correctly so that it works out as a dot product. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, how do we slide the filter over the image? We'll go into that next. Yes. Okay, so the question is, should we rotate the kernel by 180 degrees to better match the convolution, the definition of a convolution? And so the answer is that we'll also show the equation for this later, but we're using convolution as kind of a looser definition of what's happening. So for people from signal processing, what we are actually technically doing, if you want to call this a convolution, is we're convolving with the flipped version of the filter. But for the most part, we just don't worry about this, and we just yeah, do this operation, and it's like a convolution in spirit. Okay, so we had a question earlier. How do we, slide this over all the spatial locations, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to take this filter. We're going to start, at the upper left-hand corner, and basically center our filter on top of every pixel in this input volume. And at every position, we're going to do this dot product, and this will produce one value in our output activation map. And so then we're going to just slide this around. The simplest version is just at every pixel, we're going to do this operation and fill in the corresponding point in our output activation. You can see here that the dimensions are not exactly what would happen, right? If you're going to do this, I had 32 by 32 in the input, and I'm having 28 by 28 in the output. And so we'll go into examples later of the math of exactly how this is going to work out dimension-wise. But basically, you have a choice of how you're going to slide this, whether you go at every pixel or whether you slide, let's say, two input values over at a time, 2 pixels over at a time. And so you can get different sized outputs depending on how you choose to slide. But you're basically doing this operation in a grid fashion. Okay, so what we just saw earlier, this is taking one filter, sliding it over all of the spatial locations in the image, and then we're going to get this activation map out, right, which is the value of that filter at every spatial location. And so when we're dealing with a convolutional layer, we want to work with multiple filters, right? Because each filter is kind of looking for a specific type of template or concept in the input volume. And so we're going to have a set of multiple filters. And so here I'm going to take a second filter, this green filter, which is again 5 by 5 by 3. I'm going to slide this over all of the spatial locations in my input volume. And then I'm going to get out this second green activation map, also of the same size. And we can do this for as many filters as we want to have in this layer. So for example, if we have 6 filters, 6 of these 5 by 5 filters, then we're going to get in total 6 activation maps out. So we're going to get this output volume that's going to be basically 6 by 28 by 28. Right, and so a preview of how we're going to use these convolutional layers in our convolutional network is that our ConvNet is basically going to be a sequence of these convolutional layers stacked on top of each other, same way as what we had with the simple linear layers in their neural network. And then we're going to intersperse these with activation functions. So for example, a ReLU activation function. Right, and so you're going to get something like convolutional ReLU, and usually also some pooling layers, and then you're just going to get a sequence of these, each creating an output that's now going to be the input to the next convolutional layer. Okay, and so each of these layers, as I said earlier, has multiple filters, right? Many filters, and each of the filters is producing an activation map. And so when you look at multiple of these layers stacked together in a ConvNet, what ends up happening is you end up learning this hierarchy of filters, where the filters at the earlier layers usually represent low-level features that you're looking for. So things kind of like edges, right? And then at the mid-level, you're going to get more complex kinds of features. So maybe it's looking more for things like corners and blobs and so on. And then at higher level features, you're going to get things that are starting to more resemble concepts and blobs. And we'll go into more detail later in the class on how you can actually visualize all these features and try and interpret what your network, what kinds of features your network is learning. But the important thing for now is just to understand that what these features end up being when you have a whole stack of these is these types of simple to more complex features. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, what's the intuition for increasing the depth each time? So here I had 3 filters in the original layer and then 6 filters in the next layer, right? And so this is mostly a design choice. People in practice have found certain types of these configurations to work better. And so later on, we'll go into case studies of different kinds of convolutional neural network architectures and design choices for these and why certain ones work better than others. But yeah, basically the choice of, you're going to have many design choices in a convolutional neural network, the size of your filter, the stride, how many filters you have, and so we'll talk about this all more later. Question? Yeah, so the question is, as we're sliding this filter over the image spatially, it looks like we're sampling the edges and corners less than the other locations. Yeah, that's a really good point, and we'll talk, I think, in a few slides about how we try and compensate for that. Okay, so so each of these layers, convolutional layers that we have stacked together, we saw how we're starting with more simpler features and then aggregating these into more complex features later on. And so in practice, this is compatible with what Hubel and Wiesel noticed in their experiments, right? That we had these simple cells at the earlier stages of processing, followed by more complex cells later on. And so even though we didn't explicitly force our COMNET to learn these kinds of features, in practice, when you give it this type of hierarchical structure and train it using backpropagation, these are the kinds of filters that end up being learned. Okay, so the question is, what are we seeing in these visualizations? And so, right, so in these visualizations, like if we look at this conv1, the first convolutional layer, each of these grid, each part of this grid is a 1 neuron. And so what we've visualized here is the what the input looks like that maximizes the activation of that particular neuron. So what sort of image you would get that would give you the largest value, make that neuron fire and have the largest value. And so the way we do this is basically by doing kind of backpropagation from a particular neuron activation and seeing what in the input will give you the highest values of this neuron. And this is something that we'll talk about in much more depth in a later lecture about how we create all of these visualizations. But basically, each element of these grids is showing what in the input would look like that basically maximizes the activation of the neuron. So in a sense, what is the neuron looking for? Okay, so here is an example of some of the activation maps produced by each filter, right? So we can visualize up here on the top, we have this whole row of example 5x5 filters. And so this is basically a real case from a trained COMNET where each of these is what a 5x5 filter looks like. And then as we convolve this over an image, so in this case, this I think it's like a corner of a car, the car light, what the activation looks like, right? And so here, for example, if we look at this first one, this red filter, filter like with a red box around it, we'll see that it's looking for, the template looks like an edge, right, an oriented edge. And so if you slide it over the image, it'll have a high value, a more white value, where there are edges in this type of orientation. And so each of these activation maps is kind of the output of sliding one of these filters over and where these filters are causing, where this sort of template is more present in the image. And so the reason we call these convolutional is because this is related to the convolution of two signals. And so someone pointed out earlier that this is basically this convolution equation over here for people who have seen convolutions before in signal processing. And in practice, it's actually more like a correlation where we're convolving with the flipped version of the filter. But this is kind of a subtlety. It's not really important for the purpose of this class. But basically, if you're writing out what you're doing, it has an expression that looks something like this, which is the standard definition of a convolution. But this is basically just taking a filter, sliding it spatially over the image, and computing the dot product at every location. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, like what our total convolutional neural network is going to look like is we're going to have an input image, and then we're going to pass it through these sequence of layers, right? Where we're going to have a convolutional layer first. We usually have our nonlinear layer after that. So ReLU is something that's very commonly used that we're going to talk about more later. And then we have these conv-ReLU layers, and then once in a while, we'll use a pooling layer that we'll talk about later as well that basically downsamples the size of our activation maps. And then finally, at the end of this, we'll have take our last convolutional layer output, and then we're going to use a fully connected layer that we've seen before, connect it to all of these convolutional outputs, and use that to get a final score function, basically like what we've already been working with. Okay, so now let's work out some examples of how the spatial dimensions work out. So let's take our 32 by 32 by 3 image as before, right? And we have our 5 by 5 by 3 filter that we're going to slide over this image. And we're going to see how we're going to use that to produce exactly this 28 by 28 activation map. So let's assume that we actually have a 7 by 7 input, just to be simpler, and let's assume we have a 3 by 3 filter. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this filter, plop it down in our upper left-hand corner, right? And we're going to do the dot product, multiply all these values together to get our first value. And this is going to go into the upper left-hand value of our activation map. Right? And then what we're going to do next is we're just going to take this filter, slide it one position to the right, and then we're going to get another value out from here. And so we can continue with this to have another value, another. And in the end, what we're going to get is a 5 by 5 output, right? Because what fit was basically sliding this filter a total of at 5 spatial locations horizontally and 5 spatial locations vertically. Okay, so as I said before, there's different kinds of design choices that we can make, right? So previously, I slid it at every single spatial location, and the interval at which I slide, I'm going to call the stride. And so previously, we used a stride of 1. And so now let's see what happens if we have a stride of 2. Right, so now we're going to take our first location, the same as before, and then we're going to skip, this time, 2 pixels over, and we're going to get our next value centered at this location. Right, and so now if we use a stride of 2, we have in total three of these that can fit, and so we're going to get a 3 by 3 output. Okay, and so what happens when we have a stride of 3? What's the output size of this? And so in this case, right, we have 3. We slide it over by 3 again. And the problem is that here, it actually doesn't fit, right? So we slide it over by 3, and now it doesn't fit nicely within the image. And so in practice, we just, it just doesn't work. We don't do convolutions like this because it's going to lead to asymmetric outputs happening. Right, and so just kind of looking at the way that we computed what the output size is going to be, this actually can work into a nice formula where we take our dimension of our input n, we have our filter size f, we have our stride at which we're sliding along, and our final output size, the spatial dimension of each output size is going to be n minus f divided by the stride plus 1, right? And you can kind of see this as as a, if I'm going to take my filter, let's say I fill it in at the very last possible position that it can be in, and then take all the pixels before that, how many instances of moving by this stride can I fit in, right? And so that's how this equation kind of works out. And so as we saw before, right, if we have n equals 7 and f equals 3, if we want a stride of 1, we plug it into this formula. We get 5 by 5 as we had before, and the same thing for 2. And with a stride of 3, this doesn't really work out. And so in practice, it's actually common to zero pad the borders in order to make the size work out to what we want it to. And so this is kind of related to a question earlier, which is what do we do right at the corners? And so what in practice happens is we're going to actually pad our input image with zeros. And so now you're going to be able to place a filter centered at the upper right-hand pixel location of your actual input image. Okay, so here's a question. So who can tell me if I have my same input 7 by 7, 3 by 3 filter, slide 1, but now I pad with a 1 pixel border, what's the size of my output going to be? So I heard some 6s, heard some 7. So remember we have this formula that we have before. So if we plug in n is equal to 7, f is equal to 3, right? And then our stride is equal to 1. So what we actually get, so actually this is giving us 7 by 4. So 7 minus 3 is 4, divided by 1, plus 1 is 5. And so this is what we had before. So we actually need to adjust this formula a little bit, right? So this was actually, this formula is the case where we don't have zero padded pixels. But if we do pad it, then if you now take your new output and you slide it along, you'll see that actually 7 of the filters fit. So you get a 7 by 7 output. And plugging in our original formula, right, so our n now is not 7, it's 9. So if we go back here, we have n equals 9 minus a filter size of 3, which gives 6, right, divided by our stride, which is 1, and so it's still 6, and then plus 1, we get 7. Right? And so once you've padded it, you want to incorporate this padding into your formula. Yes, question. So in 7. Okay, so the question is, what's the actual output of the size? Is it 7 by 7 or 7 by 7 by 3? The output is going to be 7 by 7 by the number of filters that you have. So remember, each filter is going to do a dot product through the entire depth of your input volume, but then that's going to produce one number, right? So each filter is, let's see if we can, well, go back here. Each filter is producing a 1 by 7 by 7 in this case activation map output, and so the depth is going to be the number of filters that we have. Sorry, let me just, 1 second, go back. Okay, can you repeat your question again? Okay, so the question is, how does this connect to before when we had a 32 by 32 by 3 input, right? So our input had depth, and here in this example, I'm showing a 2D example with no depth. And so, yeah, so I'm showing this for simplicity, but in practice, you're going to multiply throughout the entire depth as we had before. So your filter is going to be, in this case, a 3 by 3 spatial filter by whatever input depth that you had. So 3 by 3 by 3 in this case. Yeah, everything else stays the same. Yes, question? Does the zero padding add some sort of extraneous features at the edge of the image? Yeah, so the question is, does the zero padding add some sort of extraneous features at the corners? And yeah, so I mean, we're doing our best to still, get some value and do process that region of the image. And so zero padding is kind of one way to do this, where I guess we can we are detecting part of this template in this region. There's also other ways to do this that you can try and like mirror the values here or extend them, and so it doesn't have to be zero padding, but in practice this is one thing that works reasonably. And so yeah, so there is a little bit of kind of artifacts at the edge, and we sort of just you do your best to deal with it. And in practice this works reasonably. I think there was another question. Yeah, question. So if we have non-square images, do we ever use a stride that's different horizontally and vertically? So I mean, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. You could, but in practice, we just usually take the same stride. We usually operate over square regions, and we just, yeah, we usually just take the same stride everywhere. And it's sort of like, in a sense, it's a little bit like the resolution at which you're, looking at this image. And so usually there's kind of, you might want to match sort of your horizontal and vertical resolutions. But yeah, so in practice you could, but really people don't do that. Okay, another question. Why? So the question is, why do we do zero padding? So the way we do zero padding is to maintain the same input size as we had before, right? So we started with 7 by 7, and if we looked at just starting your filter from the upper left-hand corner, filling everything in, right, then we get a smaller size output, but we would like to maintain our full-size output. Okay, so yeah, so we saw how padding can basically help you maintain the size of the output that you want, as well as apply your filter at these like corner regions and edge regions. And so in general, in terms of choosing, your stride, your filter size, your stride size, zero padding, what's common to see is filters of size 3 by 3, 5 by 5, 7 by 7. These are pretty common filter sizes. And so each of these, for 3 by 3, you will want to zero pad with 1 in order to maintain the same spatial size. If you're going to do 5 by 5, you can work out the math, but it's going to come out to you want to zero pad by 2, and then for 7, you want to zero pad by 3. Okay, and so again, the motivation for doing this type of zero padding and trying to maintain the input size, right? So we kind of alluded to this before, but if you have multiple of these layers stacked together, so if you have multiple of these layers stacked together, you'll see that if we don't do this kind of zero padding or any kind of padding, we're going to really quickly shrink the size of the outputs that we have. Right, and so this is not something that we want. Like you can imagine, if you have a pretty deep network, then very quickly your the size of your activation map is gonna shrink to something very small. And this is bad both because now we're kind of losing out on some of this information. Right now, you're using a much smaller number of values in order to represent your original image. So you don't want that. And then at the same time, also. As we talked about earlier, you're also kind of losing sort of some of this like edge information, corner information that each time we're losing out and shrinking that further. Okay, so let's go through a couple more examples of computing some of these sizes. So let's say that we have an input volume, which is 32 by 32 by 3. And here we have 10 5 by 5 filters. Let's use stride 1 and pad 2. And so who can tell me what's the output volume size of this? So you can think about the formula earlier. Sorry, what was it? 32 by 32 by 10. Yes, that's correct. And so the way we can see this, right, is so we have our input size, F is 32. Then in this case, we want to augment it by the padding that we added onto this. So we padded 2 in each dimension, right? So we're actually going to get total width and total height is going to be 32 plus 4 on each side. And then minus our filter size, 5, divided by 1 plus 1, and we get 32. So our output is going to be 32 by 32 for each filter. And then we have 10 filters total. So we have 10 of these activation maps. And our total output volume is going to be 32 by 32 by 10. Okay, next question. So what's the number of parameters in this layer? So remember, we have 10 5 by 5 filters. I kind of heard something, but it was quiet. 250. Okay, so I heard 250, which is close, but remember that we're also, our input volume, each of these filters goes through by depth. So maybe this wasn't clearly written here because each of the filters is 5 by 5 spatially, but implicitly we also have the depth in here, right? It's going to go through the whole volume. So I heard, yeah, 750 I heard. Almost there. This is kind of a trick question because also remember we usually always have a bias term, right? So in practice, each filter has 5 by 5 by 3 weights plus our one bias term. We have 76 parameters per filter, and then we have 10 of these total, and so there's 760 total parameters. Okay, and so here's just a summary of the convolutional layer that you guys can read a little bit more carefully later on. But we have our input volume of a certain dimension. We have all these we have our filters, right, where we have number of filters, the filter size, the stride of the size, the amount of zero padding, and you basically can use all of these, go through the computations that we talked about earlier in order to find out what your output volume is actually going to be and how many total parameters that you have. And so some common settings of this, we talked earlier about common filter sizes of 3 by 3, 5 by 5. Stride is usually 1 and 2 is pretty common, and then your padding P is going to be whatever fits, like whatever will preserve your spatial extent is what's common. And then the total number of filters K. Usually we use powers of 2 just to be nice, so 32, 64. 128 and so on, 512. These are pretty common numbers that you'll see. And just as an aside, we can also do a 1-by-1 convolution. This still makes perfect sense, where given a 1-by-1 convolution, we still slide it over each spatial extent, but now the spatial region is not really 5 by 5. It's just kind of the trivial case of 1-by-1, but we are still having this filter go through the entire depth. Right, so this is going to be a dot product through the entire depth of your input volume. And so the output here, right, if we have an input volume of 56 by 56 by 64 depth, and we're going to do 1-by-1 convolution with 32 filters, then our output is going to be 56 by 56 by our number of filters, 32. Okay, and so here's an example of a convolutional layer in Torch, deep learning framework. And so you'll see that last lecture we talked about how you can go into these deep learning frameworks. You can see these definitions of each layer, right, where they had kind of the forward pass and the backward pass implemented for each layer. And so you'll see, spatial convolution is going to be just one of these. And then the arguments that it's going to take are going to be all of these design choices of, I guess your input and output sizes, but also your choices of like your kernel width, your kernel size, padding, and these kinds of things. Right, and so if we look at another framework, Caffe, you'll see something very similar, where again, now when you're defining your network, you define networks in Caffe using this kind of proto-text file where you're specifying each of your design choices for your layer, and you can see for a convolutional layer, we'll say things like the number of outputs that we have. This is going to be the number of filters for Caffe, as well as the kernel size and stride and so on. Okay, and so I guess before I go on, any questions about convolution, how the convolution operation works? Yes. Yeah, so the question is, what's the intuition behind how you choose your stride? And so at one sense, it's kind of the resolution at which you slide it on. And usually the reason behind this is because when we have a larger stride, what we end up getting as the output is a downsampled image, right? And so what this downsampled image lets us have is, both. It's a way. It's kind of like pooling in a sense, but it's just a different and sometimes works better way of doing pooling. Is one of the intuitions behind this, right? Because you get the same effect of downsampling your image, and then also as you're doing this, you're reducing the size of the activation maps that you're dealing with at each layer, right? And so this also affects later on the total number of parameters that you have, because, for example, at the end of all your conv layers, now you might put on fully connected layers on top, for example, and now the fully connected layer is going to be connected to every value of your convolutional output, right? And so a smaller one will give you smaller number of parameters, and so now you can get into like basically thinking about trade-offs of number of parameters you have, the size of your model, and overfitting, things like that. And so yeah, these are kind of some of the things that you want to think about with choosing your stride. Okay, so now if we look a little bit at kind of the brain neuron view of a convolutional layer, similar to what we looked at for the neurons in the last lecture. So what we have is that at every spatial location, we take a dot product between a filter and a specific part of the image, right? And we get one number out from here. And so this is the same idea of doing these types of dot products, right? Taking your input, weighting it by these W's, right? Values of your filter, these weights that are the synapses, and getting a value out. But the main difference here is just that now your neuron has local connectivity. So instead of being connected to the entire input, it's just looking at a local region spatially of your image. And so this looks at a local region, and then now you're going to get kind of this how much this neuron is being triggered at every spatial location in your image, right? So now you preserve the spatial structure, and you can say, be able to reason on top of these kinds of activation maps in later layers. And just a little bit of terminology. Again, for we have this 5x5 filter. We can also call this a 5x5 receptive field for the neuron, because this is the receptive field is basically the input field that this field of vision that this neuron is receiving, right? And so so that's just another common term that you'll hear for this. And then again, remember, each of these 5x5 filters, we're sliding them over to the spatial locations, but they're the same set of weights. They share the same parameters. Okay, and so as we talked about, like what we're going to get at this output is going to be this volume, right? Where spatially we have, let's say 20 by 28, and then our number of filters is the depth. And so, for example, with 5 filters, what we're going to get out is this 3D grid that's 28 by 28 by 5. And so, if you look at the filters across in one spatial location of the activation volume and going through depth, these 5 neurons, all of these neurons. Basically, the way you can interpret this is they're all looking at the same region in the input volume, but they're just looking for different things, right? So they're different filters applied to the same spatial location in the image. And so just a reminder again, to, kind of comparing with the fully connected layer that we talked about earlier. In that case, right, if we look at each of the neurons in our activation or output, each of the neurons was connected to the entire stretched out input. So it looked at the entire full input volume compared to now where each one just looks at this local spatial region. Question? Okay, so the question is, within a given layer, are the filters completely symmetric? So what do you mean by symmetric exactly, I guess? Right, so the filters, are the filters doing the same dimension, the same calculation? Yes. Okay, so is there anything different other than they have the same parameter values? No, so you're exactly right, right? We're just taking a filter with a given set of 5 by 5 by 3 parameter values, and we just slide this in exactly the same way over the entire input volume to get an activation map. Okay, so we've gone into a lot of detail on what these convolutional layers look like, and so now I'm just going to go briefly through the other layers that we have that form this entire convolutional network, right? So remember again, we have convolutional layers interspersed with pooling layers once in a while, as well as these nonlinearities. Okay, so what the pooling layers do is that they make the representations smaller and more manageable, right? So we talked about this earlier with someone asked the question of why we would want to make the representation smaller. And so this is again to have fewer, it affects the number of parameters that you have at the end, as well as basically does some invariance over a given region. And so what the pooling layer does is it does exactly just downsamples, and it takes your input volume, so for example, 224 by 224 by 64, and spatially downsamples this. So in the end, you'll get out 112 by 112. And it's important to note this doesn't do anything in the depth, right? We're only pooling spatially. So the number of your input depth is going to be the same as your output depth. And so, for example, a common way to do this is max pooling. So in this case, our pooling layer also has a filter size, and this filter size is going to be the region at which we pool over, right? So in this case, if we have 2 by 2 filters, we're going to slide this, and so here we also have stride 2 in this case. So we're going to take this filter and we're going to slide it along our input volume in exactly the same way as we did for convolution. But here, instead of doing these dot products, we just take the maximum value of the input volume in that region, right? So here, if we look at the red values, the value of that will be 6 is the largest. If we look at the greens, it's going to give an 8, and then we have a 3 and a 4. Yes, question? Yeah, so the question is it typical to set up the stride so that there isn't an overlap? And yeah, so for the pooling layers, it is, I think the more common thing to do is to have them not have any overlap. And I guess the way you can think about this is, basically we just want to downsample. And so it makes sense to kind of look at this region and just get one value to represent this region, and then just look at the next region and so on. Yeah, question? So the question is, why is max pooling better than just taking doing something like average pooling? Yes, that's a good point. Like average pooling is also something that you can do. An intuition behind why max pooling is commonly used is that you can have this interpretation of, if these are activations of my neurons, right? And so each value is kind of how much this neuron fired in this location, how much this filter fired in this location. And so you can think of max pooling as saying, giving a signal of how much did this filter fire at any location in this image, right? And if we're thinking about detecting, doing recognition, this might make some intuitive sense where you're saying, well, whether a light or whether some aspect of your image that you're looking for, whether it happens anywhere in this region, we want to fire at with a high value. Questions? So the question is, since pooling and stride both have the same effect of downsampling, can you just use stride instead of pooling and so on? Yeah, and so in practice, like I think looking at more recent neural network architectures, people have begun to use stride more in order to do the downsampling instead of just pooling. And I think this gets into things like, also like fractional strides and things that you can do. But in practice, this in a sense, maybe has been a little bit better way to get better results using that. So yeah, so I think using stride is definitely, you can do it, and people are doing it. Okay, so let's see, where were we? Okay, so yeah, so with these pooling layers, So again, there's some design choices that you make. You take this input volume of W by H by D, and then you're going to set your hyperparameters for design choices of your filter size, the spatial extent over which you're pooling, as well as your stride. And then you can again compute your output volume using the same equation that you used earlier for convolution. It still applies here, right? So we still have our W total extent minus filter size divided by stride plus 1. Um, okay, and so just one other thing to note, it's also um, typically people don't really use zero padding for the pooling layers because you're just trying to do a direct downsampling, right? So there isn't this problem of like applying a filter at the corner and having some part of the filter go off your input volume. And so for pooling, we don't usually have to worry about this, and we just directly downsample. And so some common settings for the pooling layer is a filter size of 2 by 2 or 3 by 3, strides 2 by 2. You can have also you can still have pooling of 2 by 2 even with a stride of even with a filter size of 3 by 3. I think someone asked that earlier, but in practice it's pretty common just to have 2 by 2. Okay, so now we've talked about these convolutional layers. The ReLU layers were the same as what we had before with the just the base neural network that we talked about last lecture. So we intersperse these, and then we have a pooling layer every once in a while when we feel like downsampling, right? And then the last thing is that at the end we want to have a fully connected layer, and so this will be just exactly the same as the fully connected layers that you've seen before. So in this case now what we do is we take the convolutional network output. We at the last layer we have some volume, so we're going to have width by height by some depth. And we just take all of these and we essentially just stretch these out, right? And so now we're going to get the same kind of, basically 1D input that we're used to for a vanilla neural network. And then we're going to apply this fully connected layer on top. So now we're going to have connections to every one of these convolutional map outputs. And so what you can think of this is basically now instead of preserving, before we were preserving spatial structure, right? And so, but at the last layer at the end, we want to aggregate all of this together. And we want to reason basically on top of all of this as we had before. And so what you get from that is just our score outputs as we had earlier. Okay. Okay, so the question is, what are the 16 pixels that are on the far right? Do you mean the oh, each column? The green ones or the black ones? The one with, hold on, pool. Oh, okay. Yeah, so the question is, how do we interpret this column, right, for example, at pool? And so what we're showing here is each of these columns is the output activation maps, right? The output from one of these layers. And so starting from the beginning, we have our car. After the convolutional layer, we now have these activation maps of each of the filters slid over spatially over the input image. Then we pass that through a ReLU, so you can see the values coming out from there, and then going all the way over. And so what you get for the pooling layer is that it's really just taking the output of the ReLU layer that came just before it, and then it's pooling it. So it's going to downsample it, right? And then it's going to take the max value in each filter location. And so now if you look at this pool layer output, like for example, the last one that you were mentioning, it looks the same as this ReLU output, except that it's downsampled and that it has this kind of max value at every spatial location. And so that's the minor difference that you'll see between those two. So the question is now, like, this looks like just a very small amount of information, right? So how can it know to classify from here? And so the way that you should think about this is that each of these values inside one of these pool outputs is actually, it's the accumulation of all the processing that you've done throughout this entire network, right? So it's at the very top of your hierarchy. And so each actually represents kind of a higher level concept. So we saw before, for example, Hubel and Weasel, and building up these hierarchical filters, where at the bottom level, we're looking for edges, right, or things like very simple structures like edges. And so after your convolutional layer, the outputs that you see here in this first column is basically how much do specific, for example, edges fire at different locations in the image. But then as you go through, you're going to get more complex, it's looking for more complex things, right? And so the next convolutional layer is going to fire at how much, let's say certain kinds of corners show up in the image, right? Because it's reasoning, its input is not the original image, its input is the output, it's already, the edge maps, right? So it's reasoning on top of edge maps. And so that allows it to get more complex, detect more complex things. And so by the time you get all the way up to this last pooling layer, each value is representing how much a relatively complex, sort of template is firing, right? And so because of that, now you can just have a fully connected layer. You're just aggregating all of this information together to get, a score for your class. So each of these values is how much a pretty complicated, complex concept is firing. Question. So the question is, when do you know you've done enough pooling to do the classification? And the answer is you just try and see. So in practice, these are all design choices, and you can think about this a little bit intuitively, right? Like you want to pool, but if you pool too much, you're going to have very few values like representing your entire image, and so on. So it's just kind of a trade-off, something reasonable versus people have tried a lot of different configurations. So you'll probably cross-validate, right, and try over different pooling sizes, different filter sizes, different number of layers, and see what works best for your problem. Because like every problem with different data is going to, different set of these sorts of hyperparameters might work best. Okay, so last thing, just wanted to point you guys to this demo of training a ComNet, which was created by Andrej Karpathy, the originator of this class. And so he wrote up this demo where you can basically train a ComNet on CFAR10, the data set that we've seen before, right, with 10 classes. And what's nice about this demo is you can, it basically plots for you what each of these filters look like, what the activation maps look like. So some of the images I showed earlier were taken from this demo. And so you can go try it out, play around with it, and just go through and try and get a sense for what these activation maps look like. And just one thing to note, usually the first layer activation maps are, you can interpret them, right? Because they're operating directly on the input image, so you can see what these templates mean. As you get to higher level layers, it starts getting really hard, like how do you actually interpret what do these mean? So for the most part, it's just hard to interpret, so you shouldn't, don't worry if you can't really make sense of what's going on, but it's still nice just to see the entire flow and what outputs are coming out. Okay, so in summary, so today we talked about how convolutional neural networks work, how they're basically stacks of these convolutional and pooling layers, followed by fully connected layers at the end. There's been a trend towards having smaller filters and deeper architectures. So we'll talk more about case studies for some of these later on. There's also been a trend towards getting rid of these pooling and fully connected layers entirely. So just keeping these, just having COM layers, very deep networks of COM layers. So again, we'll discuss all of this later on. And then typical architectures again look like this. As we had earlier, conv-relu for some n number of steps, followed by a pool every once in a while. This whole thing repeated some number of times, and then followed by fully connected ReLU layers that we saw earlier, one or two or just a few of these, and then a softmax at the end for your class scores. And so, some typical values, you might have n up to 5 of these. You're going to have pretty deep layers of conv, ReLU pool sequences. And then usually just a couple of these fully connected layers at the end. But we'll also go into some newer architectures like ResNet and GoogleNet, which challenge this and will give pretty different types of architectures. Okay, thank you, and see you guys next time.